You're listening to the Sex and Psychology Podcast, the sex ed you never got in school and won't get anywhere else. I am your host, Dr. Justin Lehmiller. I am a social psychologist and research fellow at the Kinsey Institute and author of the book, Tell Me What You Want, The Science of Sexual Desire and How It Can Help You Improve Your Sex Life. These days, it seems like sex is everywhere you look. It's part of the popular songs that we hear on repeat. It's part of the biggest TV shows and movies. And it's a huge part of many major advertising campaigns. We live in a very pornified culture in many ways, but it wasn't always like this. So what changed? In today's show, we're going to explore the rise of what my guest calls Raunch culture. We're going to talk about its origins and how it is affecting society. We're also going to explore how Raunch culture affects women and the mixed messages that women are receiving about sexuality. There's this paradoxical thing where we're living in this highly pornified Raunch culture that promotes and encourages female objectification, but it exists alongside a purity culture that encourages female modesty. Women are often told that they can look and dress however they want and to embrace their sex appeal, but they're simultaneously told not to participate in their own objectification. So, how do you navigate this? I am joined once again by Dr. Bernadette Barton, a professor of sociology and the director of gender studies at Morehead State University. Dr. Barton is co-editor of the new book, Sex Work Today, Erotic Labor in the 21st Century. She is also author of the books, The Pornification of America, How Raunch Culture is Ruining Our Society, Pray the Gay Away, The Extraordinary Lives of Bible Belt Gays, and Stripped, Inside the Lives of Exotic Dancers. This is going to be an amazing conversation. Stick around and we're going to jump in right after the break. Do you want to learn more from me in the form of an online or in-person course? Become Sexceptional by getting certified with Sexual Health Alliance, where you can learn from yours truly and a number of top sexuality scholars. Each year with Sexual Health Alliance, I teach courses like Fantasies Around the World, as well as immersive study abroad classes in several exciting countries. Join these programs and become a certified sexuality professional at the same time. From sex therapists to sex educators, sex coaches to sexologists, Sexual Health Alliance streamlines your path to certification while allowing you to learn from leading experts in the field. Most importantly, you'll gain the knowledge, skills, and credentials that you need to excel. Become Sexceptional and connect with world-class experts and an engaged community of sexuality professionals from all across the globe. Start your path to certification today at sexualhealthalliance.com. If you love the science of sex as much as I do, consider becoming a friend of the Kinsey Institute at Indiana University. The Kinsey Institute is the world's premier research organization on sex and relationships, and you can help them continue the legacy of Dr. Alfred Kinsey, whose pioneering research changed everything we think we know about sex. Visit kinseyinstitute.org to make an impact. Your donations can help support ongoing research projects on critical topics. You can also show your support by following Kinsey Institute on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thank you for supporting Sex Science. Okay, Bernadette, let's talk about sex in the media. So, since the 1990s or so, it seems like sex is just everywhere you look, from music to television to films to advertising. And today we live in a pretty pornified society. This is something that you've written about and have described as Raunch culture. So, what does this term mean? What is Raunch culture anyway?
Well, the journalist Ariel Levy was the one who coined the term Raunch culture back in, I think it was 95 or 96 that her book, Female Chauvinist Pigs, came out. And I remember because I was already teaching at that time and I was like, yes, yes, yes. And I was using it in the classroom. I felt so passionately about this. And I had the background in the sex industry. So I updated it in 2021, her findings. So Raunch culture is the hypersexualization of the culture in which mainstream culture presents women as sex workers in all kinds of ways. So elements of the sex industry enter into mainstream culture in terms of dress, in terms of attitudes, in conversations, in comedy. So things that we would once have seen just in the sex industry, we now see presented throughout mainstream culture as normal, and is also presented to women as empowering. It's like, look at you, you can be sexy like a porn star, or you can be sexy like a stripper. And as someone who actually studies strippers and knows a lot about what it's like to be a stripper, I thought that was just the most bullshit thing I had ever heard. It's like this huge patriarchal con. And so I just really unpack it in the book, The Pornification of America.
Thanks for sharing that. So, tell us a little bit about the origins of raunch culture. So, the US hasn't always been, a pornified nation. If you were to travel back in time and look at advertising and other things, it's not going to look like it does today. We weren't always this highly sexualized. So, what can you tell us about when and how this shift started to occur? And do we know anything about sort of what was behind it, or is it connected to other broader trends that were going on in the culture?
Yes. And let me just clarify. I said Ariel Levy's book was 1995, but I meant 2005, not 1995. 1995 is about when I really started noticing the pornification of culture. Like I started noticing things like, did you ever watch that show Roseanne, the comedy show? And
Yep.
like in the last season, they had a porn star that was the waitress. And then the movie Barbed Wire, there was these little moments of pornification in the culture that were just very striking. And a few little moments were fine, but then they started adding up to more and more and more and more. And in my book, I argue that the pornification of culture followed the technology of internet porn. So as we saw pornography transmission change over time from, XXX films and movie theaters to VHS tapes to, of course, magazines to DVDs to the internet to tube sites. So as pornography became more prevalent online and more people were able to access it easily, the expectations of pornography filtered into mainstream culture. So I date the rise of pornification with internet pornography.
Yeah, that has me thinking about how, do you remember like back in the day, if you wanted to access porn, like it was very hard to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And you would have to go to like a video store that had like a special section in the back, that was like roped off and
Yes,
and it was
yes.
and it was sort of something where people often felt, I think, very ashamed to like walk into that area. And so just the act of accessing porn by virtue of the fact that you had to do it publicly, I think really sort of changed the way that we thought about and interacted with it. Now that everybody's got a device in their pocket that they can open and download as much porn as they want at any given moment, we have a very different relationship to porn than we did in the past.
Yes, yes. I love to talk about that with my students because in my little tiny university town, there was a movie warehouse with a little back room that you had to go to. So we talk about what that would entail. Like you have to have a car. So you have to have a driver's license. You have to have an ID. You have to have income. You have to be brave enough to go to the public place and then go into the back room and then get the porn and then take it home and then return it. It's like, as opposed to, again, opening up a browser on your phone.
Yeah, and not just that, but you have to take the video off the shelf, take it to the front, and you have to,
Yes,
interact
people
with
see
somebody.
it. Yes.
Somebody else is going to see, and then you have to bring it back. And of course, you had to rewind it back in those days as well. Otherwise, you'd pay an extra fee. But yeah, the world of porn was just so different back then, and seems so quaint in many ways compared to today.
Yes, it does.
Now, raunch culture, I think, is kind of a tricky subject to discuss, right? Because we often hear that women should not be sexualized, but we also hear that women should be able to look and dress any way that they want. And so it sends sort of this mixed message to women that can be kind of hard to navigate. So talk to us a bit about this. Is raunch culture empowering to women?
In my opinion, raunch culture is not empowering to women because it is a compulsory culture. Like you are expected to conform to raunch culture. It isn't something that you're doing out of a place of liberation for the most part. Although, let me clarify that, which is to say, you can present yourself as sexy and it can be from a place of liberation. It's not that that's not possible, but that raunch culture, if we're thinking of it as the forest, it's giving a very homogenous representation of what you're supposed to look like. I like to compare raunch culture to purity culture, and I see them as two sides of the same coin. And purity culture is this idea that women are supposed to be modest and virginal and pure and save it for their husbands, etc. But both raunch culture and purity culture are about what men want women to look like, not about what women want themselves to look like. So the solution to both raunch culture and purity culture is alignment, one's inner guidance, like having your own understanding and integrity of what you want and being able to explore that and express that. And raunch culture is sex negative, in my opinion. Like it presents itself as sex positive, but sex positivity, as you know, is about pleasure and about a diversity of bodies and experiences and people, and it's about connection and intimacy. It's not about pretending, performing like you're a porn star in order to get attention from men, which isn't that hard to do anyway. Like, it's like, why are women doing free sex work is my question as someone who studies the sex industry. Like, why do women think that it's in their best interest to give men free sex work? If we're thinking transactionally, if you're going to look like a porn star or a stripper, why not get paid like a porn star or stripper? Like, what are you getting out of that? Unless it's coming from a place where you're truly in alignment with it, which it can be some of the time. It's just that it's also happening in a patriarchal context often. So even if you're feeling good about how you're dressed sexually, you're one insulting comment or harassing moment away from not feeling good about that anymore.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the concept of sex positivity, right? At first glance, I think a lot of people might look at the growing sexualization of society as a sign that we're becoming more sex positive and more comfortable with sex in general. But as you say, hypersexualization isn't the same thing as sex positivity, right? These are different things.
And one thing I'm noticing recently, which maybe you can share if you've observed it as well, is more and more men's bodies being presented in mainstream culture in ways where they're just topless a lot, or their butts are shown and they're absolutely like flawlessly sculpted muscularly. I just feel like surely men's body images are tanking a bit with this rise and representation of men's bodies like this in the mainstream culture.
Yeah, and I think men have more body image issues than we think that they do. And I think it is definitely tied to ways in which the male body is presented in our culture. And I was actually going to ask you a question about, how this intersects with gay culture, because, right, if you think about gay culture, it is very pornified, advertising and media that caters to a gay male audience more often than not hypersexualized with, lots of men with chiseled bodies and abs and all the muscles. And, increasingly that's kind of like creeping into mainstream media where, we're also seeing heterosexual men being depicted that way as well. But in the context of like gay culture specifically, is that a manifestation of raunch culture, or do you see that as something different?
I see it first emerging from the liberation movements of the 1960s and 70s. So, and sometimes when you talk to gay people, they don't perceive raunch culture as in the ways that I described it. They think back to sexual liberation and freedom and being able to be out in bathhouses. And they see that as incredibly positive, which I agree. But that's not what I'm talking about when I talk about raunch culture. I will say that gay male culture seems to have its own toxic interplay happening with bodies and racism and youth. And there's overlap with raunch culture, but I would say it has some different dynamics because both of the parties are men. So there isn't the same kind of, the misogyny that plays out is different. And this gay male gaze instead of the heterosexual male gaze.
That makes sense to me. Now, I want to go back to what you were saying about men in raunch culture in terms of how they're being depicted increasingly in these hypersexualized ways, because as you were talking about that, I couldn't help but think about how this, to me, seems to be connected to the growing incel movement that we're seeing in society, right? Because so much of what is happening in the world of incels is tied to these overinflated standards of masculinity and attractiveness and these ideas that these guys aren't like quite measuring up. That's why, we often hear the term Chad, being used as a way of kind of referring to that guy who's like really hot and so forth. And I think as men are depicted in these hypersexualized ways and it starts to create more of this body image and anxiety and so forth, it does make it harder for guys to feel like they measure up or that they're going to be attractive or that they're going to have any opportunities in the world. And that might also be influencing to some extent women's perceptions of male attractiveness as well. I don't know if there's a ton of research on that yet, but I think all of these things are kind of connected in a way that, as you have this rise of raunch culture, you also have this rise of incels and so forth. And, these things aren't happening in complete isolation.
I think you're right, absolutely. And I would say one of the things that connects them is toxic masculinity, this idea that you have to be the alpha male and it's a zero-sum game. And as opposed to just being able to be a person. So the solution to incels is a critique of toxic masculinity. It's like there's like an easy path out of that I wish more men would take.
Well, I don't know if the path is easy, because if it were,
Maybe not easy.
we would
You're
have
right.
gotten out
That's
of
a
it a
good
while
point.
ago.
There's a clear path out of it. They just have to perceive it.
Now, I want to go back to something else you mentioned that I thought was interesting, where you talked about purity culture alongside raunch culture. And something that I think is really interesting is that these things today seemingly kind of coexist, right? Because, on the one hand, yes, it does seem like sex is everywhere and we live in this very pornified society. But by the same token, purity culture is still there as well, where, that can be evidenced through the fact that abstinence only sex ed is still, a big component of how sex ed is taught for so many people in this country. And there are still also societal expectations and standards, and this is certainly regional to some extent, but, ideas about, you should wait until marriage to have sex and so forth. Like, these ideas are still out there for a lot of people. So I don't know, can you just talk to us a little bit about how we kind of have this paradox today of like, there's both raunch culture and purity culture. How can these things simultaneously coexist?
What a good question. I'm sure that's something you have a lot of thoughts on as a sex researcher yourself. But I would say they're both connected to a sex phobia and our inability to really talk about sex and pleasure and connection. And they're both like that, I would say, is a foundation of both. So the purity culture is telling girls that you have to be virgins in order to be acceptable. And then the raunch culture is saying you should be like a porn star. And underneath it, discussions about what humans want and what we find pleasurable. I mean, I talk to my students about their sex ed all the time. And for my students, they've had almost no sex ed. And if it is, it's abstinence only, and their parents won't talk about it. But meanwhile, they were able to get on porn at 11 and see just the most kind of ghastly, scary sex acts. And there's like no conversation about any of it. And then we've got raunch culture, which is not a culture that you get to talk about either, except you can only say, oh, look at you. You look hot. And isn't it good to be hot? And aren't you empowered because you're hot? Like, that's like the end of the story. There's no more language that we have about it. And so my work is to put language to it. And then with purity culture, the language is, you need to be pure for your future husband and you need to be pure for Jesus. And that's the end of the story. And if you're not, you're just bad and sinful. With raunch culture, you're not bad if you don't participate. You're just irrelevant and you don't matter and you don't get any attention and you're not cool. Like, you're not hip. Like, there's something. But underneath, again, all that is this inability to actually talk about sex as humans with bodies that can do all kinds of wondrous things. Sex education is the solution to all of it, in my opinion.
Yeah. And all of this ultimately means many of us are getting very mixed messages about sex. Like, so on the one hand, like, sex is everywhere. And on the other hand, it's like still this taboo thing that you're not supposed to talk about. And something that I found interesting in, talking to people from different cultures who have a different perspective on the US is that they look at us and think that, we've got everything figured out when it comes to sex. So I was actually teaching a study abroad course in the Netherlands recently, and I was talking to someone there about how, it seems like Amsterdam is like this place where sexuality is something that is just much more openly discussed and freer, and people have better sex ed and all these things.
Yeah, like
and
they've got it figured out. That's what I would think.
Well, and so what was really interesting in this conversation was that she told me, like, it's actually not as great here as you think. And we actually thought that you guys had it figured out. And I was like, what? Right. So it's just sort of interesting from the outside looking in, people can have very different perspectives. And just because we live in a society where sex is all around doesn't mean that we have a comfortable relationship with sex by any stretch of the imagination.
And I would say the sex that's all around in the culture is such a one-dimensional version of sex that it doesn't even almost count. It's like cosplay for sex because it's not connected to people's actual desires.
That is absolutely true. And, something else that is connected to all of this as well is that, you've got this raunch culture around that hypersexualizes women. And at the same time, you've got all of these restrictions that are being placed on women's reproductive rights and freedoms and so forth. And so these things are kind of working in these weird opposing directions. Like it seems like if you want to have this very pornified society, yeah, it just doesn't make total sense to me.
Well, the sense is patriarchy.
Because ultimately, in both cases, it's about control of women's bodies, right?
Right. And women's bodies being for men and what they want. And teaching women that looking like a sex worker is what men want. So therefore you should do it.
So what is it that led you to study raunch culture in the first place? And why do you think it's important to research? Why does it matter?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. I was passionate about it. Honestly, reading Ariel Levy's book and my work on the sex industry, I just feel like it's completely ridiculous. Like, I mean, I guess I just feel infuriated about it. It's like, okay, so raunch culture, like, so the kids now, they grew up with it. All they've ever known is raunch culture. So they don't even blink at seeing an overly sexualized woman everywhere they go all the time. Like they just think it's normal for women to look hot and sexy constantly. And it's just so damaging. And it contributes to rape culture. It contributes to poor self-esteem, contributes to bad body image, diverts women from being able to accomplish other things. And it's basically like free sex work for men. Like it is not like I want more sex work. It's just that if you're going to be doing sex work, you should at least get paid for it. So it's like you are being manipulated to do something that women actually get paid for, even if I perceive it as exploitative and super problematic, but you're doing it for free. I just thought it was so problematic. And the fact is, it's hard for people to perceive. And even when I talk about it a lot, I often get a response of, I like it and I feel good when I dress up. And are you telling me I'm bad? Like I get a lot of that. So it's really hard to critique because you're considered a feminist killjoy like the second you do. So it's a journey, let me tell you.
Yeah, I have to imagine that it is. But, I appreciate people who are willing to take on the tough topics because we need to start conversations about them. So, I guess the big question is what can we do about all of this? It seems like raunch culture would be a very difficult thing to change because it's just become so normalized and so embedded in our society these days.
And so hegemonic. I mean, it's everywhere.
Yeah. So what can we do about it?
I think the first place to start is to perceive it, is to like just literally acknowledge it exists, like to literally just see it. And honestly, that doesn't take too long. Like I can usually get people to see raunch culture in a lecture. I use a lot of images when I do that. And then from seeing it to sort of like, okay, now let's talk about what we think about it. Like, what does it mean? What do I think about 4-year-olds twerking? And what do I think about the culture of Instagram influencers? And what do I think about everyone joking about getting an OnlyFans account? And or about, oh, I'll just go get a sugar daddy, like what does that mean? And how does it make me feel? So I think that's a good place to start. So education is good. Some people do grow out of raunch culture. So I think these are individualistic solutions, obviously. But, when like a really loving relationship with someone that you truly care about, that you have wonderful sexual intimacy with, that can help dispel some of the myth of raunch, I think. And I also think folks can do a lot with educating the younger people in their life and just having conversations about it and putting words to it. I have this theory called the condition of inarticulation, where people don't have language to discuss something. So if we have words to talk about it, that's just a really big start.
Yeah, having the words is so important when it comes to having any sexual conversation. And again, this goes back to what you were saying about how sex education is really the solution for all of our sexual problems, is because we need to have the words, the language, the knowledge, the understanding if we want to address sexual problems. And so many of us just never learn what it is that we need to know, even about our own bodies. And so, yeah, I think it is important for sex ed to also go beyond just talking about the basics, the mechanics of sex. And it's also why porn literacy, I think, is an important part of sex education. It's not included in most sex ed, but I think it can be a very important and valuable addition.
I think it's essential, actually. Can we talk about porn literacy for just a second?
Yeah.
I wrote a chapter on internet porn in my book, The Pornification of America, and I asked, interview questions about it. And you're probably aware that the internet porn there's a lot of really violent, misogynist internet porn out there, like with some very disturbing kinds of sex acts that, again, we don't often talk about because they're just so distasteful. But the young people are seeing them. And they don't have words to talk about it either. And they don't want to talk about it necessarily because it's so creepy. So what they'll do is they'll be like, oh yeah, like there was this this horrible gangbang that I saw, but it was all crazy and intense. So it's like these words like crazy and intense are very destigmatizing and unspecific to describing what exactly is happening. So 3 men violently penetrated a woman, then shoved her head in a toilet and wrote horror on her forehead. That's a specific illustration of a porn sex act that is not just crazy and intense, but really disturbing. And again, of course, yes, some people like rough sex. Maybe a lot of people like rough sex. But if you're a 14-year-old and that's what you're seeing for sex for the first time, that can really mess with your psyche. And a lot of the people I interviewed talked about that. And so there's those kinds of sexual harms happening that we are just doing a tremendous disservice to young people. Like we are just failing them to let them be abused because of the creepy porn that's been created by 60-year-old men who just think that we just got to keep pushing the edge because that's what's going to, get viewers' attention.
Yeah, we are definitely failing our kids when it comes to sex ed, and we would all do well to include more porn literacy in sex education so that adolescents actually have some context or understanding for what it is that they're seeing on screen.
They actually think that BDSM is the main way you have sex. My students tell me this. Like they think that that's the way which again, it's great. If you like that, good. But it's good if you figure that out for yourself through your own internal interest and exploration and then, feeling it out. But just to think that if there's something wrong with you, you must not like sex if you don't like these BDSM acts, that's not okay.
And, that is something that we're seeing more broadly in the research is that young adults, adolescents are becoming kinkier in terms of how they're approaching sex. And that's another way in which pornography is sort of contributing to and shaping younger adult sexuality because it's become the default form of sex ed because we're not teaching kids what they really need to know.
And so it's compulsory.
Yeah. So we could go on and on talking all about sex ed and how to fix it. But thank you so much for this interesting conversation, Bernadette. It was a pleasure to have you here. Can you please tell my readers where they can go to learn more about you and your work and pick up a copy of the new book, Sex Work Today?
Oh, thank you. Yes, my book, Sex Work Today, is a co-edited anthology with Angela Jones and Barbara Brentz. It has 31 essays in it, and it's available from the NYU Press website. It's also on Amazon and from other booksellers. And my book, The Pornification of America, How Raunch Culture is Ruining Our Society, is also an NYU Press book and available on Amazon.
And I will be sure to include links to all of that in the show notes. So thanks again so much for your time. I really appreciate having you here.
Yeah, it's been fun.
Thank you for listening. To keep up with new episodes of this podcast, visit my website, Sex and Psychology, at sexandpsychology.com, or subscribe on your favorite platform, where I hope you'll take a moment to rate and review the show. You can also follow me on the socials for daily sex research updates. I'm on Twitter and TikTok at Justin Lehmiller and Instagram at Justin J. Lehmiller. Also, be sure to check out my book, Tell Me What You Want. And if you have a question you'd like me to answer on a future episode of this show, you can leave me a podcast voicemail at speakpipe.com/sex and psychology. Thanks again for listening. Until next time.